in this debate, we have four fantastic teams. In the opening government, we have the team SSC Riga Too Old for School, who are the first cross-national couple in a debate tournament final, I'm guessing. Let's welcome them. It's marriage jokes, partner jokes. You'll get it by the end of the video, I think. Right. Opposing them in the first half of the debate, we have the first ever person to legally debate himself, which is a slippery slope argument in itself. The team from SSC Riga C. In closing government, we have the ever traditional classic debate team, a couple who represents old school values, the team from SSC Riga D. And in the second opposition, a team that might seem conventional, but at least one of them is actually an adulterer. We have the team from Tartu A. This final will be sadly chaired by me, so good luck. Joining me in the panel, there is Siim, Raini, Lauma, Ben, and our time will be kept by ViA. We are fantastic, let's welcome us. The motion before this House reads, as you can see on the board, that given the consent of the Ukrainian government, this House believes the rescue, assist in maintaining peace and territorial integrity in eastern Ukraine. The speeches are 7 minutes, just to emphasize that fact, and there are no more questions. I'd like to call upon the first speaker from the government side to open the motions that stands in his name. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable members of the House, distinguished education panel. In my 7-minute speech in this final, I will give you a brief overview of the status quo, and I will tell you about the plan, and then I will have 4 arguments, and my partner Nikita will add another 2. I will walk through the arguments as I talk about. Now, what is happening in Ukraine? We saw the president forced to leave, the corrupt President Yanukovych was forced to leave by people protesting in Kiev. This was followed by Russia annexing Crimea, and not too long after that we started to see Russian-minded protests in the east. The protests were miraculously in a miraculously organized manner. Green men appear, take over some government buildings, and then give these buildings to a little bit less organized looking protest. Now, this is where we stand at the moment. I will go more into details in a bit. What we want to do? We, as NATO, plus whoever from the West wants to join. So if, for example, Sweden or Finland or Switzerland or Australia decides to join us, awesome. We can only do it with just NATO forces as well. We would send kind of peacekeeping forces into eastern Ukraine in order to, as you see, maintain peace and territorial integrity of that region. No. Obviously, we would not set any limits on these forces, so if these forces actually need to fight Russian army, then they will. Yeah, that's my dictation. Now about my 4 arguments. First of them is rather short. We said that there is a legitimate government in Kiev. We know that there is a parliament that was elected by the people of Ukraine that has kind of elected from themselves or appointed the government, and this government is taking care of life in Ukraine as well as it can. Now, perhaps it is not doing it very well, but it is there. It is actually legitimate. Yes, Ukraine does not have a legitimately elected president at the moment, but this is not the problem because we believe that to take care of all the matters of everyday life in Ukraine, the government is doing just well, and it also has gotten there through representative democracy means. Now, secondly, and very importantly, Russia is on the verge of invasion. Why is it so? Russia, basically, there are 4 reasons. Russia is conducting military exercises just behind the Ukrainian border, with some of their ships taking part less than 1 kilometer from the actual physical border, and some of Russian planes actually intruding into Ukrainian airspace without any permission to do so. Secondly, there is a force of at least 40,000 men stationed temporarily just, once again, in the proximity of the Ukrainian border. Additionally, these are not just troops, there is also everything else that you need in a battle line, like field hospitals, whatever transport you need and all this stuff. And obviously, they are there with weapons. That's the third thing. And fourthly, there is also aggressive rhetorics coming from the Kremlin. Now, what is Russia actually doing? It is just waiting for the Ukrainian internal army, I think it's called in English like that, to attack some of the so-called protesters, and not just attack just one or two. These deaths have already happened, but it waits just for a little bit more in order to use the rhetoric that they have already let us hear for a couple of months, and say that then the Ukrainians are attacking peaceful protesters who are perhaps still not so peaceful from our point of view, and that the Russian army should then invade Ukraine in order to come in and protect these diversions. So there is a big threat from the side of Russia to Ukrainian peace and territorial integrity. Now, third, let's talk about Ukrainian resources. Yes, the country was brought to basically to the brink of bankruptcy by the corrupt government that was kind of pushed out a few months ago. But that obviously means that the country does not have a lot of money. B, the country also is somewhat internally split, or even internally split basically because throughout history Ukraine has seen Russians as brothers. So it is very hard for many of the people to understand now that someone should fight their brothers, so to say. Which means that Ukraine is not entirely able to rely on their army, on their internal forces, on their police to be loyal to the Ukrainian state. That obviously means that the state is not really capable of handling all kinds of potential situations that might come up if a foreign country is trying to do something sneaky in one part of their country. Sure.
When do you think Ukraine will be able to protect its territorial integrity on its own?
When do I think so? Right now? No. Like, when should it do so? It should do so when it can. If it sees that it is unable, it is legitimate to ask for help, and this is, based on the motion, what the government there might do. Now, that was the third point. Fourth, from the point of view of the West. We say first, we have a duty to go there and do this, because we as the West, we uphold our values. If the country wants to be democratic, if the country wants to not be overtaken by an autocratic neighbor, then we should do that. And we actually do uphold these values already in actions today, because, for example, NATO was just recently announcing that it's sending extra troops to Baltics and Poland. We also have a duty to protect the civilians, because if Russia wants to invade, there no kind of question, there will be also some civilian casualties. And finally, we say, although we don't always uphold these values, it is only in the cases where we cannot, but in this case, we can. And now, secondly, it would not only be our duty, but it would also benefit us geopolitically, because Ukraine is a place where Russian businessmen earn money. Ukrainian resources would be useful for the Eurasian Union that Russia is trying to build. And also, very importantly, we would set an example for Russian people that democratic change can happen, and it is possible to get rid of an autocratic, corrupt regime. Why this matters is because Russian people know what's going on in Ukraine, unlike perhaps about the West. Thank you, and I wish you all the best.
I thank the gentleman for his speech, and to open the case for the opposition bench, I would like to call upon the leader of the opposition. Woo!
Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you about the effects on Ukrainian people and how this whole situation will actually affect their lives and escalate further. But firstly, let me just get rid of Putin right here. Right? Okay. Firstly, what he tells us is that like these protests in East were organized by these Russian soldiers who are under the sky. I mean, this is partially true, and we do not argue with that. But what they tell you is that these people, like these people who are protesting, they're not Russians, they're Ukrainians, and they are protesting because they see that their country is in deep economic and political trouble. They see that like their rights are being undermined, and this whole fact that they are out there protesting, even though this has been allowed by the Russians or something like that. So this shows to the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people and to the world that something is not in the Ukraine and something should be done about which I'll talk about further on. I mean, secondly, what he says is that the Ukrainian government is apparently doing okay right now. I'll call bullshit on that because firstly they have huge problems with any sort of monetary resources because they need a loan from the West, anything like that. But they, as a government, have been appointed throughout the queue, and people do not believe this government is actually capable of maintaining prosperity and economic conditions. They have really huge problems with Russian gas. Why? Because obviously Russia has large interests in Ukraine. They're not going to economically interact with Ukraine right now, and so they need to find other alternative resources. So no, the government is not doing that, okay, right? And thirdly, what they say is that Russia is on the verge of invasion, right? I'll call bullshit on that one as well. Because why? Firstly, I mean, there was Cold War for 15 years where Russia and the United States were very invasion. Why didn't it happen? Because of atomic weapons, and that's pretty much obvious. What is happening right now is not the verge of war. What's happening right now is that Russia and the Kremlin is actually poking the Ukraine and poking the West to see how far it can go. And these sort of responses that we see from the West is responding to this. And what Putin actually is trying to do, these few regions in Ukraine and Turkey, his interests aren't that large. What he's trying to do is he's trying to enforce his credibility in his own state, where what actually has happened is that you have Russians protesting against the Kremlin and anything like that. And well, what happens is that Putin can come out and say, what do we do? The evil West has sent troops into the Ukraine, which is the very reason why Putin can come out and use this in a form of propaganda, and we do not think that we should allow Putin to do that, right? And what they also tell us is that the state cannot handle the problems on its own. What they tell you that it is integral for people of Ukraine, pro-Russian, Ukrainian people, whatever, to see that the state can handle these problems on their own. Why? Because they have to be an independent nation, and if the state can show that it can stabilize the crisis, that it can stabilize the crisis itself. It's actually sending a message towards the Ukrainian people that this is a legitimate state and that things are going to be better than what they were under Yanukovych, and the state, by maintaining control and forcing economic stability, can actually allow the Ukrainian people and Ukraine move towards the European Union, move towards better lives, which is the very reason why Yanukovych's government was overthrown. I'll take it.
Sir, independence doesn't mean that you have to be like North Korea. No, cooperation is allowed. Asking for help when you feel weak is a very good move by the government to show to the people that they actually
this sort of
what the real
these solutions are how we simply saying that we are taking the first step instead of Russia. We are the evil guys on perspective of Kremlin because we are putting American and NATO troops in Russia in order to, from Russia's point of view and from Russian point of view, in order to discriminate Russians. And Russian people see this, and Putin can use this to say, oh yeah, the West are discriminating Russians because they are enforcing the government that Ukrainian people do not support and do not believe in, and we think that this is fundamentally wrong. Right? Effect on the Ukrainian people. So what the motion is actually saying, and it's rather clear, is that we should put like NATO troops in Ukraine and keep the Russian troops out. Therefore, the motion is saying that all citizens who currently live in Ukraine have to be part of Ukraine regardless of what they think. Right now, I mean, the problem here is that very often you have minorities in a specific country who, given a chance, would like to actually separate themselves from that particular country. I know take Spain and Catalonia as an example. And what happens is that these minorities, they're actually not capable to do this in the current situation. No, thank you, under the current legislation. And it's practically impossible for them Do this for two reasons. Firstly, I mean, you need a really huge impact to actually put people, your representatives in the government, and you simply don't have that support from the rest of the society. And secondly, when this happens, state naming these people who are enforcing genocidal terrorists or anything like that, and these people the identity that they are going for, and the independence is simply undermined by the state. And I mean, the situation in Ukraine is unique, because why? People are now in a position to actually choose something for themselves. I mean, even if it was the Russian military in the streets, I mean, Crimea, for example, is a region with huge Russian minority, and they have cultural, historical, economic, family ties to Russia, and these people, they actually know they want to be a part of Russia. And I mean, Crimea was already historically part of Russia, and right now we can ask these people whether they want to join Russia or not. Something which never be which we will never be able to do in our West democratic model and under the current status quo in most of the countries. And regardless whether the West called this referendum that happened in Crimea, for example, falsified or anything like that, the fact is that this region has a majority of Russians, and they do want to join Russia, and we as a state are not in a position where we can undermine the choice of these people. We as a state are not in a position where what we have right now in the Western democracies, like these laws, even though they are necessary, they are fundamentally wrong at their core value. So what did I just tell you? Firstly, what we believe is that there will not, Russia and Ukraine is not on the verge of war in the sense that Putin is going to invade the whole Russia. Putin is simply using the Russian crisis to stabilize his current position through propaganda in Russia, where he's doing right now. Even though he has some interest, his interests do not go as far as for Putin to go there to invade Russia. And by responding to this provocation, we are undermining the rights of Ukrainian citizens, firstly, and secondly, we are just giving Putin more tools to play and more ways to ensure his prosperity in Russia, which is something we do not want. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his speech. And for the speech of Deputy Prime Minister, I would like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister, Nikita, in other words. Also known as. Don't be shy, speak up, Sonny. You have 7 minutes.
Sonny?
Okay, I'll speak with that. I think that Rasmus will make a really, really good dictator. That's why it's so easy. Because in his speech he said, regardless of whether referendum on Crimea was falsified or not, we believe that it matters. And for those reasons, we believe that the alternatives to solving this issue are much, much better, rather than militias that are walking around and saying, give us independence, and then Russia invading the territory and proclaiming it another part of the great Russian Empire. So, regarding the first point of Rasmus and the POI that came here from the second opposition, when the Ukraine will be capable to defend itself on its own? We say that it doesn't really matter. A, because now currently there is a huge threat to Ukrainian territorial integrity. B, because some countries like the Baltic states, for example, would never be able to defend themselves on their own, and that's why we need NATO. That's why in the first place we agreed to cooperate with our nations so that we could establish those safety nets between the countries. His second point about Putin and how this would give him even more grounds for intervention. Well, the point here is that despite some small minority in Russia who goes to Kremlin, protests against the war in Ukraine, and then gets beaten up by police, the majority of Russian population praises Putin for what he does in Ukraine. The majority of Russian population believes that those are Russian citizens living there, being oppressed by new Ukrainian government, and that's why we need to intervene there and proclaim this territory as a part of their republic. The majority of population praises him, and in order to build his political support even further, he's currently waiting for a single large enough precedent to invade the country, like it happened in the case of Georgia, and we do not want to repeat that. Last point about Ukrainian minorities. I'm actually going to devote the whole argument on that, but the short answer is follow the Scottish example, not the Crimean one, if you want to get independence from another state, and if you're a minority. And in any case, the opposition should show us why in this particular case we should grant the independence to this minority, because there is always a minority within the state that, where the majority population are minorities. Like for example, the Ukrainians in Crimea do not feel very happy about Crimea being joined to Russia. The Tatars in Crimea are not happy at all by Crimea being joined to Russia. Why do you disregard also those parties? For those reasons, we believe that referendums and political processes are much better at granting certain countries in independence. So, my two arguments. First, I'm going to speak about the Russian reaction and what might happen, what are the risks, and why those risks are to be neglected in this case. Second of all, I'm going to speak about the population of the eastern territory of Ukraine. So first about the Russian reaction. The largest risk for us is that Russia will retaliate and invade the territory and come into active war with us. Well, we say first, the odds are pretty much the same that Russia is going to invade the territory. Just in one case, if we do not intervene, Russia is going to invade the territory, annex it like it did with Crimea, and there will be no opposition to it. In another case, we give Ukrainian people at least a chance to oppose Russia. Second point is that actually if we put Western peacekeeping forces there, then there could be less grounds for Russia to justify the intervention, because peacekeeping forces are there to ensure that the steps towards ceasefire are happening. So Russia won't be that easily able to claim that this corrupt Ukrainian government that was self-proclaimed is now harming and killing our civilians, because they will have to deal with the Western peacekeeping forces that have a much better international reputation. And the third point, in any case, Russia will be regarded as an aggressor in that act, because the Western forces are coming there with the consent of Ukrainian government, while Russian forces are coming there unwelcome and uninvited. Second point, about the relationship with Russians, because they might speak about that in the future as well. First, we don't really understand why do we need good relationship with Russia, because we already failed to cooperate on such important issues as Syria, Iran, Ukraine now. So we do not really see any benefits of trying to keep good relationship with Russia, because there are no good relationships with Russia, and the relationship are anyway on the lowest point since Cold War. Please provide an example of possible cooperation in the future that which benefits might outweigh the possible harms of this intervention. Second, because Russia will always pursue its the geopolitical goals that are beneficial for it. This is how Putin builds its ideology, right? This is why majority of the Russian population praises it, because the Russian population feels really nationalist. They want to feel really a part of a great Russian empire. So Putin says, screw you, Western world. We're going to disregard what you think. We're going to pursue our beneficial geopolitical goals because we are so great. One point about possible relationship with Russia that might come: gas and EU dependence on that. First, we're saying that it's summer now, and by winter time there is a high chance that we are going to deal with this conflict. Like really now is the best time actually to say screw you Russia, because now for the next 7 months we are not that dependent on it. Second of all, Russia needs to sell the EU gas just as the EU needs the gas from Russia. So not selling the gas to the EU will harm Russia at least as much as it will harm us. Finally, money is never a justification for immoral behavior. Now about the eastern population. First, it's not really clear at the moment whether they want independence, because now there is huge Russian involvement in the region with media, through media, through internal agents, and through empty promises of a better life. We believe that there are legitimate means to achieve independence, and violence is never a good instrument, because it's not justifiable because it coerces the other people who are not okay with independence, and it doesn't provide them an opportunity to show the free will. The great alternative is the Scottish example. First you have a public discourse and sharing of ideas and peaceful debate about what is better for the state, whether to pursue independence or not, and then you vote on it. This is how democracy works, because in this case this will reflect the will of the people who live in that territory in the most ideal way. So for the reason that the legitimate Ukrainian government wants it, and needs help now, for the reason that it's our duty and it's beneficial for us as the Western society to help them, and that we should disregard Russian relationships because they are never going to get any better, and Eastern population has other legitimate means to fight for its independence. We're proud to propose.
Now I thank the proud gentleman for his speech, and now to call upon a speaker who might seem familiar, but is definitely a different person who stood before you 7 minutes ago. Opening opposition, your second speech, please.
Mr. Speaker, what I will extend on is the international and domestic attack in Ukraine and the world. And firstly, let's talk about it. Right? Well, what he tells us is that the Ukrainians and the Tatars are also happy as a minority in Crimea, as a region. What he tells is that it's better to have a region with minority that supports government than majority that does not support the government. If we have this region of Crimea as a part of Ukraine, most of Crimean people who are Russians, who are pro-Russian, who want to be a part of Russia, who support Russian government, they are simply forced to be living in a country and support and live under the laws and conditions of government that they do not support. Yes, few Russians and few Tatars will stay in Crimea, but this is the same kind of situation as any other minority situation that we have in the world, and there's simply nothing that we cannot do. A democracy at its basis means that we cannot fully we have trade-offs and we cannot fully satisfy the interests of all these people. But the idea is that we should better satisfy the interests of overwhelming majority in this case in Crimea, which is the pro-Russian population. Right. Secondly, he says that well, Russia will invade the territory. Even if we go through what they are proposing, even if we put our troops right there on the ground, fine, the Russia might not invade because Russia does not want the conflict. But what they will do instead is that first they will have a basis for justification towards what they have been doing. I mean, it's the evil West, they're even putting their troops on the ground in a territory which is integral. West is no better than West is actually no better than us, and simply strengthens the Russian propaganda position, the Russian international position, and the bias of people towards Putin that Nikita talked about, which is something that we do not want to happen. Sit down to. What happened? And well, it's something that we do not want to happen. Yeah, and well, thirdly, like Nikita talks about the relationship of Russia, things like that. He says, I mean, we don't need a relationship with Russia. We don't need a relationship with the largest economically and in terms of citizens, largest country in the East. I mean, are you serious? Even though the situation, like regarding relationship with Russia, is as bad as it has been since Soviet Union went down. But the thing is that by doing this, we're actually driving ourselves deeper and deeper into the hole from which we will no longer be able to climb out. What we're simply saying, no, thank you. What we're simply saying is that okay, right now we create another I know imaginary economic zone where we put NATO troops and Western troops on one side, Russian troops on the other side, which means that we are actually moving away from better relations with Russia. And even though yes, Kremlin rules in Russia, and Russian political and business elite rules there, and there's not a lot that we can do about it intentionally by building better relationships with Russia, like the situation where we were, I don't know, after the Soviet crisis, after Soviet went down, things like that. I mean, this kind of situation is one towards which we should strive rather than go away from, which is like what they are proposing. Yes.
Please provide an example of an issue where we could build a plan of good relationship with Russia and which benefits would uphold the territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state.
I mean, Russia has, if we can ensure that Russia cooperates with West, the West economically in terms of resources, this sort of relationship would lead to benefit for all Western nations, not just Ukraine, which is actually something that we were going for before this crisis, and something from which we would be going away by putting our troops in Ukraine, which is something that we simply do not want to do. Right? International domestic. Right?
Currently, Russia, has not officially invaded parts of Eastern Ukraine, not talking about Crimea. And if they do this, if they go to another Eastern regions where Russia is not that heavy, overwhelming majority, think the way that it was in Crimea, and force other Ukrainian people to join Russia, it would be a completely different situation. Then we say, yes, maybe we do need to send these. Maybe then we do need to send in Western groups, because then we can see that human rights have been abused, and this sort of situation is something that we cannot comprehend. But currently, this thing simply has not happened. And if we, as the Ukrainian government, take this course step in bringing an army into these regions, we are actually creating another Berlin Wall, as I said, another economic family relationship wall. And I mean, the situation is very unstable for the Ukrainian government. But firstly, they need financial support for the West. So basically, what they say, the new Ukrainian government actually has to prove that it can sustain itself financially, and economically, and politically. Because currently, they are in a position where they have basically taken over the country through a coup. And even though, yes, they have established democratic process, and they have gotten rid of Yanukovych and some sort of Russian influence, they still can prove that they can ensure any sort of economic, political, or freedom of rights stability. And no, thank you. And I mean, the reason you have these extremist pro-Russian groups is that, even though they might be the provocation by the Kremlin, they do not believe. Most of them who are there are Ukrainian people who do not believe in the government's ability to ensure that Ukraine can sustain itself economically, about gas, and politically through a government which is democratically elected, by showing that we can ensure the stability in our own country by ensuring the situation stabilized through the actions of the government. What we do actually be doing, instead of running to West or help in terms of security, we'd be showing that we are capable of doing this. So what we have pro-Russians who would feel even more oppressive. We have Ukrainian people who do not believe in the government. And I mean, if we ensure stability on our own, we can ensure that that we can actually get loan from the Western, and we can move towards better living circumstances and better living circumstances for all of the Russian citizens. And I mean, even if pro-Russian citizens, they can see that we have a stable government right now, and there will come election, they'll be able to elect new representatives that I want to see. They're more likely to accept this new government. It's more likely to lead to better, stable democratic situation, rather than in the alternative that they are proposing, under which we are simply enforcing these people to believe in this new government, believe in these strategies, and to believe in what they are doing, which is something that we do not want to do. And for all these reasons, thank you to oppose.
I thank the gentleman for his speech. And now moving on to the second half of this extremely jolly and happy debate, I would like to call upon the member of the proposition to extend the basis case.
Mr. Speaker, we think that in principle we should always help our partner countries when they are faced with imperialist oppression. But even without that principle, we think that doing this benefits us massively, because now we change the political capital balance of the world towards our side and less to Russian side. Secondly, we think that it's better for Ukraine, and thirdly, we think that it's better for the IR and the world holistically. I'm going to explain all these things. Before that, a bit of rebuttal. Now, some things we get from Rasmus that are not going to be addressed in my speech. People don't believe in no government. Compared to whom? Putin? We think that that's empirically wrong. The populations have been surveyed of what they want to do before Putin invaded eastern Ukraine, and they somehow magically haven't changed their opinion. If they said then that they don't want to be part of Russia, they wouldn't be saying that now under fair ballot conditions, which were in place. Second thing, Russian gas problems seem to be a big issue in this debate. Let me clear that up. Negotiations between EU and US are happening now. The world knows that US has the capacity to export gas to Europe, and it's building that capacity to outreach to Europe. We think that in the medium term, it's not a problem of dependence on Russian gas. We think it's even better for us because we have seen that we cannot depend on Russia, and we are better off if we're independent and we're partnering with the US on that. So we think that's clear. Third thing, relationship with Russia is worse. Well, we think that, on the contrary, the more we let Russia expand its term of influence, the worse our relationship gets, because their ambitions get bigger as they go. We think Crimea is a perfect example of that, of how Putin went from meeting one state to the other. So our case. Firstly, to establish why this is the best thing to do, we have to prove to you that there are no alternatives if we have to solve this conflict. So, to do that, firstly, 5 alternatives that are going to go through. Firstly, sanctions are useless. We think that what we've done so far is eject Russia from G8, moving US warships to Black Sea, lessening trade ties, hasn't seemed to work, has it? We think that it has been no effect because there's clearly not enough deterrence, and Putin knows that West can't do enough. That's where I go to my second point. The tough multilateral sanctions are also very unlikely, because Russia is part of the World Trade Organization, which guarantees no trade barrier, which is our main weapon. We think that it allows some flexibility if the UN could make the decision, but surprise, surprise, Russia also has veto powers there, so multilateral responses not really happening. We think, third thing, that there is a control mechanism of what Putin could do and how it could be stopped is democratic control. Well, we think that is unlikely as well, because the Russian level of democracy, Mr. Speaker, is much lower than Western countries. We think that the people in Russia, even if they would be opposed to his imperialist wishes, can't really oppose him. You know, there's not such thing as an opposition, like practically. But also we think that most people don't really want to oppose Putin on these matters, because like the last public survey showed, like 43% of Russians called the Kiev government change a violent coup. And even more blame the Western influence for the situation in Ukraine that as bad as it is now. We think that people naturally consider Crimea to be part of Russia, the Russians in Russia. And we think because of Putin's spreading the nationalist ideology, we think the people in Russia are even furthermore happy to expand. So there's not likely that any democratic control could happen in this case. Fourth thing that they might bring up, and it still doesn't work, destroying Russia through oil prices. We think that is much too long-term as a solution. We could theoretically drop the price of the barrel to, like, let's say $90, and then significant losses from Arab countries are incurred. We would in first place have to convince them to do so. But secondly, we think that namely it's going to be hardest in countries like Bahrain and Oman, which are important allies militarily in that region. And we think that region is currently as important to us as Ukraine, because we need their support to solve things in Iraq, to solve things in Syria, where we have people underrepresented as well. And we think we cannot focus all our things in Ukraine. Fifth thing, precedent. We think as status quo, Putin can be easily comforted by us not doing nothing in 2008 when he globally invaded South Ossetia and Abkhazia, with troops even at status quo redrawing borders further and further to the Russian side. We think that our response was shameful, and that's exactly what Rasmus said. That like, oh, now we don't know whether Putin can invade. He can invade. We already showed him that he can, and he's still doing it. We think that we have let these people down, and we cannot allow this thing to happen again with Ukraine. Now, why this changes the world balance of political power to our side? Firstly, we think it de-escalates the conflict. Because, recognize, Mr. Speaker, there's a clear deterrent for open conflict. Firstly, because obviously trade relations. It's not really beneficial for Russia if war starts with the West. Well, it's already invading Ukraine now. Its economy is dependent on exports, and it will incur major losses, which means that Putin's regime could go down. Before my second point, sir.
Yes. Could you tell us how long it would take for you to get your troops to Ukraine?
Yeah, I can tell you how much it would take for Putin to take over Ukraine. The last estimate is Putin has enough troops next to the Ukraine border to do it in 5 days, to cover the whole Ukraine. We think it's likely that he would do it, but it's not likely that he would do it if there are Western troops there. Why? Second point of my argument. I think that both sides, if the Western armies are there, would incur massive losses. because recognize that both US and Russia have the capacity to destroy each other. And if we involve many countries, it is not beneficial for neither of the countries to start an open conflict. Well, it would be beneficial for Putin if it was just Ukraine on its own, because he can roll them over easily in a matter of days. So what this does is it makes us better to solve things because we de-escalate the conflict. We provide less precedents for Putin to actually make these things further, and we don't allow Putin's influence to expand. This concerns more than Ukraine. This concerns Syria. This concerns Baltics, Azerbaijan, Finland. We think the status quo is against Putin. That's why he has to change the way the world works, the way influence is divided in the world in his favor. That's why he's been imperialist, that's why he's been expanding. If we allow him to expand further, he will. Why is this better for Ukraine? Another argument. We think that we can agree that it's not great to divide nations. A lot of shared interests lost. Now, if Russia is taken over, that will do more harm because it creates artificial borders between families and nationhood. Russian propaganda war is also much more likely to start once he's in control and invaded some parts of Russia, which means that people in Ukraine who used to be one nation end up losing their shared commonality, and we think that's a massive harm for the country. Mr. Speaker, what we wanted to say today is that we want balance, not bullets. And even if we have bullets, we want those bullets to be ours, because we're the ones who can ensure a good outcome, and they can't.
I thank the gentleman for his speech, and now I would like to give the floor to the team that has not yet spoken, at least formally. Kristen, I guess you're up.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I think there are two very important questions that have not been analysed in this way. Firstly, who is us, who we have the obligation to? We think that the West and us, for example, is NATO. We do not think that we have an inherent obligation to protect Ukraine. We think that we must prove to you that for the West it's beneficial, for the West's interest it's mainly probable that the situation under which we actually go into that state would cause negative things. We think thus that's our burden. We think that if in the end Eastern Ukraine will go to Russia, we're fine with that. Second thing, what the prop side has never analysed, they say that Russia will be mad, and then we will go there, and then what happens afterwards is this mystery. But in the end, we have cooperation and gas, and we'll get to resolve conflicts in Syria and all those other things. We think they've never analysed what will happen afterwards. We think that what will happen afterwards is a large conflict with major casualties where we are not going to win, because, ladies and gentlemen, Russia is the most powerful conventional warfare country in the world. We think that we cannot actually save Ukraine by the way that they're trying to do so. We think that that's not realistic. I think that there are two scenarios. Scenario A, Russia is cool, will not intervene. This is what the opening spoke about quite a lot. And we also agree that there is a very large likelihood that will not happen. And thus we believe that we also have alternatives, which I'm going to speak about later. I think that the scenario B is that Russia will be mad. And we're going to prove to you that if Russia is mad and will intervene and go into Ukraine, then we, the West, are going to lose a very, very long war which brings casualties to everyone, and the opportunity cost is massively not worth it. My material. First I'm going to speak about warfare, and secondly about alternatives. Before that I have three larger points to what the government has talked about. Some of the things I've already mentioned. For example, Martin says in his 6th minute, when he decides to give us any reasons why we should do anything, says that we have a duty to do it. We didn't understand why we have a duty to do it. We think that we have practical reasons why we do it. We do not think that we have an inherent duty to Ukraine. We think they're not in NATO and we should not protect that. He said that we do it already because we're sending troops to Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. We do it because that's us, that's the NATO. That's the obligation that we have to. We do not have an inherent obligation to Ukraine. They've never proven that to us. Second thing, they say that there's gas and cooperation stuff we need from Russia going to cooperate. What do you think Russia would think if we will send troops into the very same region that Russia wants for themselves? Plus they have tremendous amounts of justifications for their own citizens who massively support, for example, intervention of why, we should go in there. We think that Russia would be rather mad. We think that they will not give us gas, they will get gas anywhere, somewhere else. If they say that gas is that important to Russia, then why not we deal with that gas? We think that we can take the opportunity cost of losing some money and finding our own resources somewhere else. We think that's fine, even if it is some cost. But we think that going to a full warfare with the proposition is proposing is not going to work. And the last thing about alternatives and how there is kind of stuff getting in us with votes, I will speak about later. I would think that we do have alternatives, and even if the last alternative is that peace in Ukraine will be annexed, that's fine. Yeah.
So justification. A, moral, we believe that people shouldn't suffer because they were born in a state that is not able to defend itself. B, monetary. This region is hugely beneficial for Russian experts, thus we do not want the geopolitical balance to shift.
We're going to lose monetarily tremendously with an open warfare. We're going to lose Western states will lose, Ukraine will lose. Going on to my material, I don't think you have an obligation to Ukraine simply because those people are dying. We think that we do have an obligation to our own citizens. People who we're going to send in there, people whose resources we're going to send in there, and people who we're going to have an immense threat to. My material, firstly, let's speak about warfare. The stuff that, the proposition has neglected. Firstly, we think we have the opportunity in today's world to use strategic weapons. Let's nuke everyone. Don't do it, it's rather negative, everyone will die, you get it. Second opportunity is to do conventional warfare. That's what they're proposing, send in troops. We send in troops, Russia sends in troops. Even if Russia does not send in troops, they have the pro-Russian troops, in there, who probably will be rather mad, even if Russia isn't, which will create a very clear justification why Russia should do it, and probably will do it because it has the support of the regime. And thus, we would have to use more invasive weapons in order to be stronger than that, because Russia, from the Cold War time, has the most powerful conventional warfare capacity that anyone else has, which means that we have to use tactical weapons. They will use tactical weapons. In the end, the only last opportunity that we have is using strategic weapons, which is already mutually exclusive destruction, something that we do not want. The only way of warfare, the third one that we are doing, is proxy wars, and that's what we are proposing as well. We think that we can finally support Ukraine, we can, give them weapons, do all of those nice things that proxy war allows us to do by supporting. We think that by sending in conventional warfare, we will lose that war and also create an immense, ramifications for us. We think that if we would send in men in there, that even if Russia themselves will not send in the troops that the prime proposition already proved that they already have, what will happen is that those pro-Russian troops that are actually real, not only the green ones, but the actual real pro-Russian troops will be mad. They will actually go and do something, which means that the people who are living there, the Russian people that the Russian rhetoric is always protecting, will be in danger, which means that Russia will have to invade. They will have to invade because the only rhetoric the Russian regime, which is, by the way, failing, is working upon, is the fact that we're winning, it's the fact that we're fighting everyone else, it's the fact that we're the winners, the fact that they have immense support from its people to go to Georgia and Crimea and all the other places. We think, thank you, that thus Russia will do it. Impacts. Firstly, we have a huge threat to our own people. The home people who actually go there will go there as a capacity or casualties, and also simply because it's war and such and all of the other ideas that I told you about how it will escalate. And secondly, we think that it will last forever because there is a huge anti-Western sentiment in that area. We will have to stay there because we cannot have those people for ourselves, which means that we will have to stay there and fight the strongest conventional warfare that there is. We think that it will last forever. That's a major opportunity cost and not beneficial to us. Alternatives. Proxy war. We already talked to you about how that's beneficial. We can do it. Secondly, we think that we haven't really been very strong in our sanctions at the moment. We don't want to use sanctions that tackle the people because we think that their rights, etc., etc. We think that we should do it. We think that there is an immense opportunity cost, but that's a lot smaller than the opportunity cost that we have by putting in troops and actually escalating a very large conflict. Thus, we believe that we should be very bold with our sanctions, but never sending men to that, exactly what the proposition is doing. And even if that fails, even if Russia takes eastern Ukraine, we think that's fine because Russia will never be bold enough to start a war. The obligation that we have relies on our own people and inside the NATO. We think that losing Ukraine in the end is fine, even if the opportunities we spoke about. Please oppose. Thank you.
Right, I thank the man for his speech, and now moving on to the whip speeches. As always, the proposition gets to go first and sum up their bench first. So go ahead, Ruta, the floor is yours, 7 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we think the opposition is living in a parallel universe. They're not engaging with any of our material and the justifications we do give you as to why things will not quite happen the way they're trying to tell you that they're going to happen. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, what is the best course of action and how we decide that? Secondly, why we benefit. Thirdly, why Ukraine benefits, right? But firstly, 3 points of rebuttal. So what they tell us firstly is that it's not really our obligation. We tell you that, first of all, we think that we do have an obligation towards our allies to support them and help them. But secondly, even if we didn't, right, we've proven to you that this massively benefits us and that we're in a better situation if we do this. So it doesn't really matter whether we have that obligation or not. It's also not actually true that Ukraine has absolutely nothing to do with the NATO. They actually signed a deal with the NATO, and we think that we have an obligation through that as well. Second thing they tell us is Russia will be mad and there will be full-on warfare, which is a horrible thing. We already told you that this is never ever going to happen, right? Russia is not going to attack United States. Russia is not going to attack any Western countries that have the capacity to give them, first of all, huge losses, and secondly, who they have huge amounts of trade with, and without whom they cannot really survive economically, right? We think that for that reason, war is not really going to happen. They're just going to be deterred from it, and we think that's better. So, and just by the way, Russia is not the most militarily advanced country in the world. The United States outspends the next 26 countries, most of which are Western in terms of military spending. We think we're fine. We don't think that we are under huge threat of losing to them necessarily. And they don't really also have a basis to consider this like us going in there an invasion. What was the suggestion coming out from second half of opposition, right? Because consent is mentioned in the motion, right? We actually asked the Ukrainian government whether they think this is a good idea. We leave when they tell us, which also deals with the issue they said, well, when is Ukraine going to deal with themselves? And how is that going to happen? We think the Ukrainian government can make that decision. Third thing they talk about is sanctions. Let's just do some sanctions and it's going to be super awesome. Again, ignoring everything the Gediminas tells you, right? So they say that it's just like, oh, it's going to be economically costly and that's the only reason why we cannot do it. Not really. We think that we're in the World Trade Organization where we have certain obligations towards other states. The only way to exit those obligations is through the UN, which we cannot do because Russia has the veto power, right? I think that even if it was the case that we could make horribly big sanctions, we think that it's very likely that Russia could survive that in the end. So, and still maintain their policies and actually perpetuate the narrative of evil West more. Okay, so what is the best course of action? First, a clarification based on what Rasmus was saying on the choice of being legitimate. We think that a decent separation is not necessarily something we need to come about now. Even if it is true, there's people in Ukraine who would rather live in Russia, and that's a perfectly legitimate choice. We don't think that when there's Russian military walking around with guns is the best time to make a vote and a referendum and choose that. There's absolutely no legitimacy to that. We don't think that we should be talking about that necessarily. So, what are the other options that we have? First, government already outlined the problems with funding, which is why Ukraine cannot defend themselves necessarily. We don't think that Ukraine can solve everything themselves. Gediminas has extensive analysis on all the other alternatives that we could possibly have and why they specifically cannot work. As I already said, sanctions, in Maribel, sanctions will not work. We also added an analysis on how oil price pressures cannot work because they will damage us immensely and our allies, which is going to be problematic, like in the example of Bahrain and Oman. We also don't think that Russia necessarily has democratic control, that's out of the question. So all in all, chances are there's absolutely nothing else we can do. So why will this work? What happens afterwards, which was the question that they were asking us, right? Gediminas tells you the mechanism of how this will deter actual warfare, right? Why? We don't think that necessarily we will fight among ourselves. We already saw it in the Cold War that generally countries wanted to avoid directly engaging each other in warfare, the countries that can destroy each other to like a huge degree because of the losses and the possible harms that can come from that are immense, right? The second opposition also asked us about, well, how much time will it take us to get there, right? We think that we have had cases when we make a decision and we're there in a few months' time. It's not necessarily like the case that we cannot have a fast, move there quite fast. So we don't think it's an issue anyway. So also another thing that Rasmus mentioned and why he thinks that this plan will not work is gas and oil, right? So we think we can help with this. We can help Ukraine with these things so that they're not damaged to that extent. We think that we can bear that cost, especially when the comparative alternative that we're given is sanctions, which would actually also cost us probably a lot more, right? So, wait. Why we benefit, or POI maybe, before that, no? Okay. Why we benefit? We think that Russia is a bully, right? They saw that in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they could just go and do whatever they wanted. There was absolutely no reaction, we just forgot about it. And we didn't even flinch when they were taking extra territories recently, right? Ultimately, Putin can do whatever he wants to do, and we can see that he can do whatever he wants to do. And if we let that happen and keep it that way, we set an incredibly dangerous precedent for this to continue on in the future. Secondly, we think that peace in that region is incredibly important as well, right? We're not going to benefit from Russia messing with people and oppressing them in Europe. We think that's a problem as well. But we also think we also think that international standing in our case is better if we actually stand for the values that we have said we will stand for, right? And we actually uphold them in the end, right? So Rasmus said that this will promote the evil West narrative. We're not sure why maintaining peace in his mind is synonymous with oppression, and why necessarily people will see this in a bad way. But we also think that the narrative right now, when we're actually not helping and we're failing at everything, is that we're weak and that we don't care, right? And those two narratives are as bad as anything else that Russia may brainwash people with. For those reasons, we think that Ukraine benefits, we benefit, and everything is nice and fluffy on our side of the house, and really crap on theirs. So, thank you very much.
I thank the madam for that comprehensive speech, and to invite the last speaker for the opposition bench, and in this debate tournament as a whole, no pressure, Seem, you are up.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, you know why Cold War was not a hot war? Was because we actually did not try to fight each other. We tried to keep out of those spheres that one of the superpowers thinks it's theirs. We did not send our troops to countries that Soviet Union had great interests in. What we did, we fought proxy wars. We fought proxy wars in Ethiopia and Somalia. We fought proxy wars in Angola. We fought proxy wars even in Afghanistan. Why? Because it was safer for us, and we have an obligation for our own people, for our allies, not to put them in danger. I will summarize this debate in 3 points. Firstly, there will be war. Secondly, we have alternatives. And thirdly, we have different obligations that the common bench tries to show us. Now, there will be war. Why will there be war? Firstly, Martin said, our troops could fight Russians if necessary, right? And okay, even if we believe that Russia will not intervene, our troops will have to fight those insurgents in those regions. They will have to fight those Russian insurgents. state provided insurgents in those regions, which would mean that we would have to actually engage with them, and as there is a big sentiment against Russian and against Western forces, we would have to fight more and more and get our own troops to engage and escalate the conflict even more. Okay, now let's look why there will be why Russian forces will go into Ukraine. Why? Hey, you guys said, the prop said that it takes 5 days for Russia to invade Ukraine. How the hell do you think you're going to get enough men into Ukraine before Russia, when we are going to push its hand, we are going to decide that, hey, we are now going to take your sphere of interest. Russia will be pushed into Ukraine, and you know what? They cannot go away, because their rhetoric says that they can never go away. The rhetoric says that they will always have to defend their people there, and that's why Russia will technically just go into Ukraine, because they are already ready. It would take time for us, and that would be difficult to do. Now we see that we actually cannot take our guys then there. Well, even if we have enough room to station us to sit, then what it means is that we would have to actually engage in warfare with Russia, and that is not possible because of the mutual assured destruction doctrine. And you know what comes to conventional warfare is that Russia, although they do not have the best equipment, they have the most tanks. They have sheer power in conventional warfare since the Cold War and during the Cold War has been bigger than the West collective. And you know why? Why we know that and why this is true? Because that's why we got this doctrine of man, right? We saw we cannot fight Russian sheer forces, so we built our case on strategic warfare and said, hey guys, you don't want to attack us, we don't want to attack you either. But there will be a problem. We say that either our forces will have to fight insurgency in Ukraine forever because the anti-West sentiment will not go away, or the Russian interest won't go away. So our forces have to be there. Or in my scenario, if the Russian forces are going to be pushed into Ukraine, they will stay there forever because they cannot leave. So either way, the Ukraine will be pretty much, how do you do it? So, come on, sit. Now, the second one. We have alternatives. Firstly, let's deal with the analysis, not the thought that we dismissed. We said, of course, there are opportunity costs there, and this is bad, but it's much less than the risk of active warfare or the risk of our own troops lost in Ukraine for a unforeseeable future. Secondly, we say Gediminas analyze the material, analyze the ways that we have tried to do before. Please sit on your bench. We say that we've been pussies. We need to be a bit stronger. We are much up. When we have ways to do that. We can influence them economically, as you said yourself that there are ways that Russia is interested. But most importantly, what we can do, if we cannot follow, if we cannot change the Russian regime, but we can fight proxy wars without any significant harms to us, because this proxy wars will either be fought between Ukrainians and Russian militants, or Russia and Ukraine. But either way, we will not be doing the fighting, right? And our people are not going to die. Our people are not going to suffer. Second.
Your proxy war is a worse version of what we're offering. Because of our analysis, we know that Russia could allow itself to have an open war with Ukraine, but couldn't do that with the West, given that the West has super capacity to destroy it.
Yeah. The fact is that if Russia has those strong incentives to go to Ukraine, and this is not what you want to say that they don't have, right? And if we are going to push Russians' hands, they are going to go to Ukraine, like I explained before, because, well, technically we just cannot maintain this force before that, that we would stop Russians to invade. Then, well, you don't really have those alternatives anymore, and the proxy war is the only way we can deal with it. But I know thirdly, we do have obligations, but what obligations do we have? We have obligations towards our own people. Well, we do not really see that we need to protect Ukrainians. They are not our NATO allies. If they would be, Russia just annexed half of their country, for God's sake. Why did we do anything? They are our allies, right? We didn't do that because this would have been not cost effective to us. This would mean that we would really make a huge risk engaging in open warfare with Russia, and we are not going to do that. For those reasons, that there will be war, and we have alternatives, and other obligations, I beg you to also.
Alright, thank you, gentlemen, for his speech. And let's give a huge round of applause for all the finalists. Well done. Right. And exit in a graceful manner to make a decision outside, hopefully, because there's a lot of fresh air and sunshine. Please. Yes! Brilliant. In heaven, yes, outside of heaven. Outside Singapore.